Professional. Pastor. All right, we're live. All right, welcome everybody to live Q&A. This is Pastor and the Recovering Heretic. I am Pastor Dave.
And I am Recovering Heretic, Dan.
Dan, hi, how are you?
I forgot that part.
Yeah, that's okay.
I am good.
Good.
Good. Yes. It's been a while since we've been here.
It has.
So
it's been a long time.
I feel rusty on even just on the intro.
Right. Like, how do we do this again?
Yeah, just don't. Yeah.
Church in space, Pastor, what are we?
Yeah. Well, it is. Every time you say we're live, I want to go in 3D.
Right. So many intros, so little time.
Which, if people don't know about who are watching this, we have a podcast.
Yes, we have a podcast, and you should listen to it. And the first episode of its recently victorious return has happened.
Season 2.
Season 2. So you can listen to our podcast, Church in Space.
In 3D.
Yeah, it's a great.
Yeah. Okay, let's do it again.
Church in Space.
In 3D.
All right. Yeah. See, it's muscle memory at this point. All right. What's our topic? We should probably talk about it.
We should get into our topic. Our topic today is John again, but this time not the Baptist guy.
Yeah.
But
the gospel.
The gospel guy.
Okay.
And as you have pointed out, there are so many Johns in the Bible. It's tough to keep them straight.
Yep.
But partly because, we have this wonderful reading from John, and we've mentioned before, one of the things that I love about John is it's like reading poetry.
Yep.
Such a better writer than the other gospel writers.
Yeah.
But we pay a price for that because his gospel is so radically different, even in its content, than the other gospels.
Yeah.
And part of that is that John seems to actually delve into actual theology and philosophy. Whereas the synoptic gospels, they're more like watching an episode of Dragnet, right? It's like just the facts.
just give me the facts. Yeah.
Jesus was born. Jesus did this. He performed this miracle. Then he went here.
Yeah.
0855, Jesus spotted in Capernaum.
Right.
And that's how the synoptics are. But then John comes in, and it's all, he was the Word.
Right.
And the Word became flesh.
The Word, and the Word was God.
It's very poetic, and under that poetry is the theology.
Right.
So my big question is, to start things off, why that difference? Who is John writing for versus who the other gospel writers were writing for, that we needed that huge change in tone and content?
So tradition says it's the Apostle John. Tradition, we date this gospel to around the 90s, which is about 30 years after Mark. If you want to, early 90s, like 25, 30 years after Mark.
So about 60 years after Jesus,
right?
30 years after Mark.
Right.
So by the time of John, I would imagine there aren't a lot of eyewitnesses left.
Yeah, right. So that's part of it, right? So by John's time, there are fewer eyewitnesses. Again, this is all the gospel. The author of the gospel actually doesn't have a name, right? It doesn't say I am John. All it says is that the beloved disciple wrote it. So, that's. But that said, if it is John, John's always traditionally been a much younger man. He's a think of him like 16. When he's following Jesus around. So it's actually probable that he lived. It makes sense that he would live longer than Peter or that kind of stuff. John's home territory is Ephesus. That's the church where that's his seat.
Now, where is Ephesus?
Turkey.
Okay.
Turkish coast. So, coast of Turkey off the Adriatic. So basically. That's traditionally been his home seat and where he's been, where he camps out. So that's his community he's writing for.
And is he the only apostle that doesn't end up being martyred? He actually dies naturally?
Yeah. So again, by tradition, he's in exile on the island of Patmos, where he writes the book of Revelation, right? So he's in exile on house arrest on the island, basically, is the tradition. So yes.
Okay.
So it's different, I think, if you accept that it's written later. Part of it's just the other three gospels were out there by that point, so the biography part had been done already. If that makes any sense, like
a Hollywood producer, we got to do something new, something different.
Something new, something different. Well, and just you didn't need it, right? I mean, that was taken care of. So that was out there. It was wandering around. People had that already. So I think that could account for a lot of it. John's just telling a different story, than the other ones are. So,
well, there's an element to John that I find haunting. On that note, right? If this is the John that was the apostle, and there was this intimate relationship, there's a depth of knowledge that he would have of Jesus, and almost insiderish in that. No, I mean, I knew this guy super well, so I know what he was really trying to say.
Yeah,
he could get beyond,
get deeper.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, they all have a different, like all of us, we all have a different relationship with Jesus. They all had a different, Peter's relationship with Jesus as leader is different than John's relationship as intimate friend, and I think those are not better or worse relationships. They're just different relationships, and I don't know if it meant he knew the words better. I just think he knew them differently, right? Like, again, Peter has a depth of knowledge of Jesus as this guy who's picked to be leader, and and he has a pretty good intimate understanding. Also, it's just a different intimate understanding than John does. And
that's true. You're not going to have your legacy planning and appoint a leader that you don't think really understands.
Right? And to that matter, Paul has also an intimate, he has a direct knock off your horse revelation from Jesus Christ, but it's different than the guys who knew him bodily, and so it's not that they don't have this intimate relationship, but it is different, kind of scattered across whoever you're talking about.
Well, now that, since we're on intimacy, and this is a sensitive topic today.
Okay.
It probably wasn't back then. And I say this in advance. I'm not saying this to be tittillating. It's a genuine question in that, for example, we look at David and his relationship with Saul's son. And it looks, even in the Bible, it reads a lot more than just besties.
Yeah.
I get the same impression that there was more to the intimacy of Jesus and John when I read John. When you talk about things like he rested his head on Jesus's chest or his lap, and those kinds of descriptions sound like more than just really good friends.
Yeah.
And again, looking at it in a modern light and the way we view those things today,
right,
so different then. Was there a possibility of that, or
no?
Okay.
I guess I would say no. All right. So I have two things. Yes, the resting in the head, the bosom thing seems more intimate in our world than it really is. But you got to remember that everybody in the ancient world ate reclining. So like you're literally always resting against
the person next to you.
The person next to you, right? Because you ate on your side, literally. Like. They thought eating in a chair was for poor people, like only the rudest, like the most crude of the crude ate at a table with chairs, like barbarians did that, not civilized folk, so
that's fascinating.
Yeah. So ancient dining rooms are actually in Roman houses that we've dug up. Their dining rooms are actually really big because you had to accommodate couches
for people to be reclining.
For people to be reclining. And if you were rich enough, you had multiple dining rooms because you couldn't fit everybody in one. There's only so many couches you can fit.
Yeah.
Right. But so they had multiple dining rooms, really big houses. So that's just the nature of the ancient world, and they just ate differently than we did.
Yeah.
Well,
and especially in the U.S., we look so askance at physical contact with friendship.
Yeah, right. And right. It's just not how we emote.
Throws us off when we go to Europe,
Right. Everybody's,
You kiss when you see it.
Right. You're touched and right. The other, there's a just a basic practical issue of consent around whenever we're talking about Jesus and his possible romantic relationships, and the issue is you can't consent with somebody who has authority over you, right? Basic rule, you know. You really then can't consent with the Son of God.
That's a lot of authority.
Right, you know, and especially in John, where he has like the ability to read minds, you know, like, and uh, you just can't do it. Like, it would be the mother of all problematic relationships, you know. Because somebody who has the authority to forgive sins could read your mind and was the one for whom you were created and in whom you have your being. You know, like, you just can't consent to that. It would be too much. So both those together would be like, no. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
It does. But it's just one that
does look.
Since I was a kid, I was thinking.
It does look, and the David and Solomon thing is different, but it does. I can see where you're getting it, but it's a function, I think, of the way ancient societies interacted as much as anything else. You know, like you said, it's like being in Europe. You know, it's just different. So, yeah.
Cultural accommodation.
Yes.
Cool.
Yes.
Yeah, that one's just been out there, and I just wanted to. For me, it's almost like personally.
Yeah.
Well, Renee wants to know, given all that, then does that contribute to the reason why we, in the Roman Church, priests have to be celibate? Because again, you know, they are seen as a big authority figure.
Yeah,
which is
right.
A big reason behind the abuse process.
I mean, well, yeah. I tend to think the celibacy rule is less the cause for the abuse. That's a different thing. But I tend to think being celibate doesn't make you abuse kids. Right. You know, like that's less.
But I'm thinking that the position of authority makes it easy.
The authority, yeah. You know, I guess I would say the Catholic Church has many and various reasons for the celibacy rule. Part of it is, yes, Jesus himself. Part of it is theology around ordination versus marriage, which are two different vocations, two different sacraments. Part of it's a practical reason. You know, it's you want to know what the biggest practical impediment to the Catholic Church marrying their priests is?
Yeah.
They have to pay them differently. Well, honestly, think about it. Their pay scales are all based on if you're a single man.
Living in the parsonage.
Right,
too.
living in the parsonage, right? I mean, actually, if you paid a family what Catholic priest, it'd be a slave wage. You know, because they get their pay scales are all based on single men. You know, our pay scale, our pay scales are based on families, right? They assume that there's a family to take care of.
Yeah.
You know, but honestly, that's the biggest practical. Like, there's a theological impediment, but like, there's this huge, like, it would upend the entire pay scale of the Catholic Church if you, like, you know,
the whole HR department would be.
Yeah, it would just, it'd be really hard, you know, nobody ever thinks about that, you know, and so, but it's a practical reason, right? It means you can have more priests in one area because one parsonage can have multiple priests in it, you know, and that kind of thing, right? Like, it, there are practical realities that it helps, you know, as much as anything else.
That's interesting. Yeah, we get so caught up in the theological differences.
Yeah, there's administrative reasons too.
There's
a simple bureaucratic reason as well, you know.
Yeah.
So anyway, yes.
Actually love that.
It's the mother of all bureaucracies, right? I mean, it's literally the first bureaucry.
Yeah, I know. The most founded bureaucracy.
Right, it started bureaucracies. So, you know, like, they've thought about these things for 1,000 years. They know what they're doing.
We got to keep costs down.
Right.
Celibacy. That's the answer.
Celibacy. It works. So.
God, I can just see a major corporation trying that.
Yeah. They'll all be celibate. We won't have to pay health insurance for the kids. It's true.
No executives can be married.
Right.
Going completely off the bureaucratic side of things, then. John gives us a very big view of the cosmos.
Yep.
And the synoptics don't. The synoptics, it's not only that the synoptics read like they're just on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
They do read like they're just in this tiny little portion of the Mideast, for the most part.
Yeah.
Whereas with John, it's expansive. It's the very creation of the universe
right.
and
the world and
yeah,
right.
the world. And the world is, instead of being in the others, you still get that Old Testament view that the world is under a dome, and that's all there is. It's this part under the dome.
Yeah.
Whereas with John, the world, you do feel like the world is just this tiny speck in this vast creation.
Yep. Yep.
Why? How? It almost seems difficult to believe that John came out of the same group as the other 11 apostles.
Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit more big picture stuff. We it's so been hallmarked that like we don't really pay attention to it in the other gospels. Like the big one is at Christmas, and we hear this so much that like we don't think about it, But if you think how the Christmas story begins, right?
Mhm.
In the blank year of Caesar, Caesar Augustus declared that all the world should be taxed. This was
Yeah.
the first registration taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and
Yeah.
What's his name?
But again, I mean, it's solidly anchoring us in the Roman Empire.
It
This
is,
little...
but it's very. But you got to remember, the Rome was like the known Earth, right? And so it starts. So in Luke, you start at this way big up here, the known world, right? And you start with elsewhere in Luke, right? You start with Luke, like Zechariah in the temple, which is also way up here. It's up here on the religious scale, but it's
because the temple
Zechariah
is the center of the religious
right,
universe.
it's the center of the religious universe, and Zechariah is in the Holy of Holies, doing the sacrifice, and so he's in the holiest part of the of the earth, and so he's way up here. And then it gradually gets kind of narrated down.
Yeah.
But, Luke does this too. Just he starts way up here, and,
brings it down to the grass.
Brings it down to the grass, right. So other ones do it. It's just a different Mark just doesn't have enough time to do it. Mark's got it's an action movie gospel. It's like the John Wick version of gospels. Like, like no character development, just,
resurrect hard with a vengeance.
Right. Just bam, bam, bam. Like, it's like, he's the Son of God. Get over it. You don't need to know anything about his childhood. He was baptized by John. Even the wilderness story in Mark is only one sentence. He went out into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan. And he was out there 40 days and 40
seen.
Right. And see, yeah. And it's like, and then he came out, So Mark just doesn't have enough time to do it. And Matthew is and that's not Matthew. It's partially about what all their goals are. Matthew's goal is to prove that Jesus is the promised one prophesied by the Old Testament, and so you don't need to do that cosmic scale thing for Matthew.
Yeah.
Because
the important thing is the promised one was supposed to come here.
Right, exactly. And it's the promised Jewish Messiah. Like you don't need to do that cosmic level thing. Whereas John wants you to know that you and the whole world have life in Jesus Christ. And that's a much more cosmic scale life thing. It's just much more cosmic, and so it's about their goals.
Well, and that about their goals really gets to a nice point, because clearly they each have an agenda based on who they were writing for.
Mm-hmm.
So, you mentioned Matthew focusing on the Jewish Messiah and how that's fulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
What was Luke focusing on? Mark, and then contrast that. Who was John's audience? Who was he writing for? What was his agenda?
We don't know exactly who his audience is. They're probably Gentiles. They're Gentile Christians. They're probably also facing some difficulty with Jewish authorities. It's kind of a Jewish, because higher ups in John are always like are more hostile than in the other ones, and so it's probably some sense of that going around in John, to his community.
I mean, would you go so far as to say there was like a feeling of anti-Semitism?
I personally, okay.
Yeah.
This
I know
is
sometimes I jump into this.
Well, no, it's a good question. John will say the Jews an awful lot.
Yeah.
And I would, so first, I think that's a bad translation. I think you should hear the Judeans, as in those who lived in the province of Judea, right?
Yeah.
Not the Jews, but like we think of it today.
Yeah.
Some scholars would say yes, John and Matthew struggle with anti-Semitism. I would argue they both thought of themselves as Jews. They were Jews, and so it's not anti-Semitism. But it is read anti-Semitically because, as I've said before, anti-Semitism is so baked into Western culture. It's not that they wrote it there, it's that Western culture is so anti-Semitic that we read it into the Gospels. And that might be a fine distinction. It ends you in a similar place, but I think it's important to say, I don't think that anti-Semitism is inherent to the book itself. I think it's something we bring to the book
From our cultural background.
From our cultural background, right? So they all thought of him. I mean, even if it's John the Apostle, he thought of himself, he was a Jew, So I don't know how he could write a book that's anti-Semitic if he was Jewish. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It would just be like, I'm not sure how that. Same thing with Matthew, right? That's weird to me, and so I don't think it's possible. But anti-Semitism is so baked into the Western culture that we then take John's comment about the Jews, and then we read that anti-Semitically, right? Does that make sense?
It does. Part of me is looking, though, too, that Christianity shapes so much of Western culture today.
Yeah, I would say this is one that predates Christianity. Like, Rome was virulently anti-Semitic, as was Greece.
Greece as well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They were right. There was a huge revolt. The Maccabean revolt was started because the Greeks couldn't get over the fact that they wouldn't let a pig be sacrificed on the altar of Yahweh. Yeah, that's what the whole Maccabean revolt was all about. Actually, it was King Antiochus set up a statue of Zeus and tried to sacrifice a pig on the altar of Yahweh, and they went into open revolt over it.
Wow.
So
I did not know that.
Yeah. So both Greece and Rome are virulently anti-Semitic themselves, and there's just no way around that. So it predates Christianity.
Yeah. So it really is baked in from the origins.
Yeah. I mean, it's right. It's deep in there.
Wow.
I'll put it to you this way. If Christianity had not become the dominant religion of the empire, I am pretty sure we still would be wrestling with anti-Semitism, in Western history going forward.
Why? I mean, relative to those empires, it's such proportionately small portion of the population.
Yeah.
Geographically small portion of each empire.
Right.
So why? Why have such a virulent
People
feelings?
don't like distinctive populations. Independent, distinctive populations make people uncomfortable. And if you can't, a Jewish community is very distinctive and independent. They do what they want, right? They do things differently.
So because you're not homogenizing with the empire.
Right. They were automatically distinctive. They looked different. They ate different. The circumcision thing is a much bigger deal in their world than it is in ours because people were naked more frequently, and so you can tell, they physically, everything about them physically looks different, and their bodies look different, and so this is not to justify it. It's a bad instinct in human culture, but it's also true about human culture that distinctive minority populations especially get targeted.
Yeah.
They become convenient scapegoats, which is what Jews have been. They've been scapegoats forever.
Whatever the wrong is, blame it.
Right. Blame it on them because they're this distinctive population that speaks differently and talks differently and eats differently and worships differently.
So you can paint them as the other, the stranger.
Right. The other, the stranger. In Rome, they're also considered unpatriotic. kind of borderline unpatriotic. They refuse to make sacrifices to the emperor, so you get all the kind of problems that go with unpatriotic populations, that we face today,
Yeah.
so.
Well, this takes us a little bit further off topic, and we'll get back. But why does it maintain today? Because we live in a much more polyglot society. Even America itself is very multidimensional.
Yeah.
So why would something like anti-Semitism still be there?
Well, at this point, it's so baked in, I mean.
Well, particularly for Christians, shouldn't we be unbaking it, taking it out of the recipe, the cultural recipe? We're supposed to be about love and acceptance.
Yeah, I think so. But we've talked about sin isn't a knowledge problem, right? And so sin's not a knowledge problem. So there's a strain of Christian thought which is wrong and terribly anti-Semitic and wrong, but it's said they killed Jesus. They're the ones responsible for the problems. They won't just go, in with the old, in with the new, out with the old. We're the new. They should just come over to us, and they're not.
Yeah.
It's kind of where it begins, right? So that's the essence of it. And there is, beyond the anti-Semitism, there is a disagreement, right? We think the Messiah comes, they don't. There is a disagreement there, and that's not to justify the anti-Semitism, but there's an origin point for a lot of Christian anti-Semitism that's about blaming them for things that they don't deserve to be blamed for, but they get blamed.
For convenience. For power?
Because people are looking for something to blame. It's called the scapegoat mechanism. People are looking for. We restore peace to human communities by collectively blaming another. And
instead of taking the responsibility.
Well, it's not even about responsibility. It's instead of refocus. It begins with anxiety and desire, and so instead of refocusing our anxiety and our desire, we focus our anxiety and our desire on rivalries with each other, and then we that creates strife. And then to solve that strife with each other, we all lash out at a community, at a distinctive individual or population that can be easily scapegoated.
So we find an easy target, regardless of.
Yeah, right. Yes, it's called the big anthropology term for it is mimetic rivalry. You get caught in desire over the same thing, and eventually that builds and builds and builds until the only way to release the pressure is to unleash it in some way. So communities create peace frequently by unleashing it on some innocent victim. So that's done. Sometimes that's done ritually, like the Bible literally describes a ritual. This is where we get the word scapegoat. Actually, the Bible literally describes a ritual for the scapegoat. Societies that practice human sacrifice, this is literally what they're ritualizing this process. They're ritually sacrificing a human to relieve that tension. Or it can be done through lynchings.
That's what was coming to mind.
Right.
I've never understood the whole lynching mentality.
Right. It's this process at work, and so you do it through lynchings and synagogue burnings, or so
beatings.
Yes, beatings. Yeah. So wow. If you want to know more, it's called read Rene Girard. A book, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. There's a good book about it. So Rene Girard.
It sounds like Girard takes a theological slant, not just an anthropological, from the title.
He's an anthropologist turned Christian. So he starts off as an anthropologist and becomes a theologian. And actually, he developed this mimetic theory before he became Christian, and then he started looking at the Gospels through mimetic theory, and he actually converted out of that experience. And for Girard, this is what's important about the crucifixion and about Jesus, is that Jesus upends the whole mimetic system because he reveals it. He's the one who willingly becomes the scapegoat, and thereby, because the mimetic system only works if you don't know you're doing it, and so Jesus takes the cloth from all our eyes by going to the cross, and thereby becomes the willing victim. To the point where Girard says this is where Christianity has fundamentally changed society. He still says that before Jesus, no society thought victimization had any power, But now being the victim actually grants you power, right, in our world. And he would say this is actually fundamentally where Jesus has changed the world, in that it's no longer the ones doing the victimizing that have strength in our culture. You have to, even if you're victimizing somebody, you have to argue that you're a victim in some way, right? And Girard would say that's Jesus changing the script fundamentally, because before the Romans didn't care if they were the victim or if they was justified, or they had strength and they were going to use it, and that's what ancient cultures were. And that gets changed with Jesus, who shifts our perspective. Wow. So that's a big meta level thing.
Well, I've got like a skazillion more questions on John, but we only got 2 minutes left.
We'll come back to John.
Yeah, we'll definitely come back to it.
John's always going to be there.
So just to continue with that, where we've gone, given that Jesus flips the script, that he willingly accepts this.
Yep.
Why do early Christians feel any need to blame anyone, Pontius Pilate or the Pharisees or whoever, for Jesus' death, if A, Jesus accepted it, and B, it was necessary to fulfill the prophecy? So,
well, nobody gets blamed. I mean, Pilate's the only one actually named. All the creed actually says is, for us and for our salvation, he came down from heaven. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. And so Pilate's actually the only person. This is the other thing. If the early church was as anti-Semitic as people sometimes say it was, like they would have written it into the creeds. But actually, the only person that got blamed was the Roman official. The Romans deserve. I mean, just because Jesus willingly accepted it doesn't mean the crucifixion's good. The Romans deserve to be blamed for it. So it's right to name Pilate. It's also part of the reason is it's subversive. It's undercutting the empire. It's saying, yeah, your officials are responsible for all this, by the way. The only other people who get blamed is Peter will, in the book of Acts, sometimes when he preaches to crowds, say, you crucified him, as a kind of general you. But Peter always follows that up with, you crucified him out of ignorance. And
so it's not quite a blame thing.
It's not a blame thing. It's, you did this out of ignorance. Now it's time to be awakened, but that's never Pilate. Pilate never gets that treatment. Pilate just killed him,
Yeah.
So
end of story. And I know, a lot of, not fairy tales, but cultural stories from Europe in particular. There's a lot of follow-up.
There's a lot of follow-up
stories about Pilate. Yeah.
He is a haunting character in the Gospels. I do think there's something to him being a haunting character. The all-powerful governor who has no control, over the situation is actually, and that's part of John's crucifixion narrative, is John goes at great lengths to picture how Jesus is actually the one in control, even in his own crucifixion, and Pilate can't do anything but proclaim who Jesus is. He puts the crown on him, he puts the robe on him. Pilate's trying to mock him, but he's actually, all he's doing is he seats Jesus on the throne. He's trying to mock him, but all Pilate ends up doing is proclaiming who Jesus is, which is part of John's point, is evil, even when it's trying to be evil, can't help but proclaim the greater glory of God, in the end anyway.
Wow.
You know.
That's a solid ending point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can't get around it.
At some point, we'll get back to John himself.
Yeah, we can get back to John.
But for today, that was interesting side path that we took.
Yeah, it's always good to wander through mimetic theory once in a while.
Yeah.
So
Cool. Well, thank you as always.
Yep.
And thanks everybody for watching, hanging around.
Yeah. See you all.
See you next week.
Yeah, mimetic theory.